So Nick Patel is the founder and CEO of Wellable, a wellness technology platform that enables organizations to create programs that help employees thrive by engaging them in holistic well-being educational modules and activities. He's also an adjunct instructor here at GW School of Medicine in our Integrative Medicine programs, where he's teaching right now as we speak in one of our spring courses. Mr. Patel is experienced in business, wellness care, and wearable technology, which he will be introducing us to today. Take it away, Nick.
Okay, hey everyone. Share my screen here. Great. Thanks, Lee. Appreciate it. As Lee mentioned, the title of this and focus of this kind of presentation is Wearables in the Workplace. I've thrown in, when we originally created the presentation or content, it was pre-COVID-19. So I threw in some information and things to discuss kind of what this world may look like after the pandemic. A couple things to note about this presentation, as it may differ from others, is one, it's a little bit shorter. So I'm kind of focusing on kind of foundational pieces in knowledge, which will kind of hopefully play well into the panel conversation and discussion. Two, as my background kind of suggests, I am not a doctor, so neither a clinician or an academic. So the perspective I often come from is a little bit different, mainly around, piggybacking in some ways on what Dr. Dudley was saying and Dr. Baban was saying, in that we have a number of technologies that exist that can help improve our health and well-being. There are a number of kind of ways to address that. In some cases, it would be a clinical setting, whether inpatient or outpatient, whether it's a consumer setting where someone can, by their own kind of fruition or drive, want to improve their health and engage in, the various things that are out there. And there's also a setting that, what we would argue is a huge player, if not kind of the primary player in some ways, moving the needle as it relates to health and well-being, and specifically in non-clinical applications, so really around lifestyle wellness, and that's the workplace. Wearable technology, because it's alliterative, we call it wearables in the workplace, but really what we're seeing is wearables being a single term for apps and devices. So whether it's a Fitbit or Garmin, which is traditionally seen as a wearable device, or an Apple Watch, or a mobile app that people are downloading. So the good part about where smartphones are heading in some ways is that these technologies can often replace or kind of supplement what previously were limited to actually having to purchase a device. So why focus on the workplace? Obviously, we spend a ton of time at work. If you just, especially in the US, if you remove time for sleeping, kind of routine activities, whether it's eating, commuting, things like that, work is the primary setting, or kind of where people are most engaged by just a measurement of time in their lives, especially during kind of really critical years of their life. And so the workplace is a natural setting for a couple reasons to address it. One is the time element. The other is, for most individuals in the United States, especially those of working age, they're getting their health insurance, which is their clinical coverage, from their employer. So in that scenario, there needs to be some financial interest or kind of sponsorship of many of these technologies. And the most logical owner outside the individual is that employer, who has, something to gain, whether it's from lower healthcare expenses, higher gains in productivity, and things like that, to actually invest to improve the health and well-being of those employees. What we find, though, in some ways, is that despite the impact that wearable devices or these technologies can have in terms of not just quantifying where people are in terms of their health and well-being, and often in many ways encourage them through notifications and things like that to improve their health, the real adoption is happening on the consumer end. And I don't think that's really shocking, for a couple of reasons. If you think about something that most people can relate to around the smartphone adoption, it was really employers were lagging in that. Minus a couple of industries like banking or things like that, it was really individuals coming into the workplace saying, I purchased a BlackBerry, which was the original smartphone, or Palm, to the iPhone, and bringing that into the workplace, where the IT departments were there having to adapt to that, saying, now look, our employees are expecting to have their email and things on their phone. We need to create a strategy about which we support and kind of leverage those technologies happening. The same thing's happening in the wearable device market, just at a much smaller or much slower scale. And again, I don't think that's necessarily surprising if you think about the breadth of impact, especially just from personal lifestyle reasons that the smartphone has on individuals. So much of the internet, the growth is really kind of off the chart. You're seeing very strong growth as it relates to adoption with wearable devices and digital health tools, being apps. And you see here, I think what you'll notice a couple of things about adoption is that the wearable ownership has appeared to plateau in certain ways. I think part of that's driven by two factors. One, early adopters drive growth really quickly. Secondly, we're realizing that there are many apps and technologies that are for free that people can download on their smartphone, which most people nowadays already own. And in that scenario, I think it's cannibalizing wearable ownership to a certain degree. When you look at digital health tracking, which is primarily defined by apps, you can see that growth being fairly significant as well. I know this data is from 2019, but all kind of initial indications of what industries are seeing a little bit of a COVID boom in some ways is are app downloads, and that certainly applies to health apps as well, as individuals are kind of quarantined, not able to go to the gym and things like that. A lot of data from App Annie and things were more timely as it relates to April 2020. That growth is, if anything, getting accelerated by the current environment. So similar to the way smartphones impacted the employer setting, the consumer market is again impacting and driving wearables into workplace. So for many employers, if I talked to them 5-10 years ago about thinking, have you thought about including these technologies, a wearable device or a mobile app, into your employee wellness program? The often rebuttal or kind of conversation we had was largely driven around, would people actually use it? Not, well, is there enough adoption within our workplace? And now that we've kind of shown proof, whether it's through classic wearable devices to the migration to smartwatches, those drivers of adoption that have largely existed in the consumer market are beginning to get employers and sponsors of these employee wellness programs to really think about how they can be used in the workplace. I think when we look at wearable devices, or wearables in general, there's a broad array of things they can track, right? The most common and most kind of where things started were with steps, activity, maybe using GPS technologies to track, how far you're going to run or bike to measure that distance. There are things like heart rate and blood pressure. There are other even kind of more novel or kind of more futuristic in some ways measurements that people are doing on a daily basis, whether they're disease management tools like glucometers or other tools like that. But really what's driving adoption for the vast majority of the market, which is where employers need to be focused on and where they are focusing on, is around steps and things of that nature. But what really kind of drives individuals as it relates to steps is making sure they have information that's valuable to their health. And I think part of this is driven by a lack of awareness. So not understanding certain clinical measures doesn't mean necessarily they're not valuable. It does imply that maybe the individual, the employee, doesn't necessarily know how to interpret that information. And one of the presentations previously discussed, how do you go beyond just providing information and providing ways that is actionable upon that information. So the consumer perceptions of wearables often has a big driver of what it means in terms of adoption. I think, as I noted before, steps is kind of the primary driver for consumers for why they engage. Heart rate tracking is kind of second. I think one of the things we think about, certainly in the academic or kind of clinical settings, is thinking about items that don't necessarily drive adoption or adherence to the technologies, but are really, really important. And so what I mean by that are, if you look at the third bullet point, accuracy, comfort, and ease of use are the reasons people use wearable devices or what they find important in wearable devices. And only one of those is really important as it relates to outcomes or ways to improve health, which would be accuracy. Comfort and ease of use were obviously 2 and 3, and very closely behind accuracy, which begins to talk more about a business element of how companies selling wearable devices or companies looking to use them in their program have to think about just the usability of these technologies, not just the outputs by which they deliver and what they can do. Fortunately, what we've seen over the last kind of half decade or decade is a shift from these traditional wearable devices that were very kind of one application, which was tracking steps, to being multi-application, including things that don't necessarily track or relate to health and well-being. So if you think about the ability to do contactless payments, that, especially in this environment, but was already trending prior to the current situation that we're in, was increasing and provides more reason for an employee or an individual to adhere to using the technology. So to the extent that these smartwatches give you the ability to listen to music, read your text messages, do all these number of features that don't necessarily relate to health and well-being, they help drive the use case for health and well-being, because it's more likely that those employees will keep that device on, make sure it's charged, and becomes a critical aspect of their daily life the way a smartphone is today. A couple of trends in the workplace. One is very, in workplace wellness, that is, one is very physical activity focused. I don't think this comes as a big surprise, but as we think about wearables and mobile apps, we look at our program at Wellable, we are a holistic wellness program. And so if you really just want to share content and share kind of modules and interventions, the vast majority go beyond physical activity, because that's just one element of what we do. But the vast amount of usage is still dominated by physical activity tracking. Part of that's driven by what the type of programs employers want to create on our platform, but part of it's driven by that consumer perceptions that I discussed earlier, which is people see today the value of wearable devices primarily around steps, perhaps around heart rate, but it's really decided and kind of really focused on physical activity. We are seeing a transition to holistic well-being. I know Dr. Baban mentioned mental health, and I think if there are silver linings with the current crisis that we're going through, one of which is an element that employers are beginning to think about and engage and implement programs that often deal with mental health, which was often seen as taboo, things that managers did not want to talk about in the workplace. And so holistic well-being is certainly beginning to become a bigger piece of that puzzle. As it relates to health and well-being and wearables, it's hard to see how holistic well-being today is going to be critically built upon this wearable device technology. Are people using the wearable device to meditate? Yes, in the case that you're counting a smartphone in a smartphone app. Are they using their wearable device to track nutrition? Yes, but it's not, again, a wrist-worn device. It's really built around these smartphones and technologies, which have really just made it easy to do on a mobile phone, less about something critically inherent in having hardware specific to that function. And the last piece is, because employers need a reason to spend on these programs, there's got to be a value prop to them. And so over the last 20 years, just employee wellness, I think, has changed the way it talks about health and well-being, from return on investment, which is very financially centric, thinking if I can invest $1 today in an employee wellness program, can I extract to $3 in savings, and really make a clear financial case for the program. I think employers have been coming to realize two things. One, it's really hard to measure in some ways. So how do you measure the hard return when you have a population that's changing? People are being terminated and added all the time. When you have situations where there are a lot of confounding variables, it becomes really, really difficult to measure. So they've transitioned over to this value on investment approach that begins to look beyond just financial savings to include employee satisfaction, employee productivity, overall happiness, both in the workplace and outside the workplace, and things like that. One of the things we benefit from, I think, as wearable devices become more prevalent from consumers and begin to get supported by these employee wellness programs, is the public health benefits. It's always hard to know what you don't know. And I think that's the stage we're in as it relates to the studies of how do we aggregate large population data of these wearable devices. I know one of the speakers mentioned Eric Topol, and he actually was involved in the study I've referenced here, which was effectively taking Fitbit data to see if there could be a leading indicator of flu-like symptoms in certain geographic regions around the US. So when we see the CDC report flu data, it's typically a backwards view. So by the time we get a view of what January looks like, we're well past January from a time perspective. So looking at this wearable device data, be able to geographically contain certain regions and identify where maybe there's an influx or increase of where the flu may be rising, and allowing public health officials, local hospitals, other stakeholders to take actions to help prevent that going forward. Because this adoption is so new and more data is coming available, more and more individuals are having it. So we're not also focusing strictly on specific cohorts of individuals who maybe can afford the technology or things like that. As the prevalence of smartphones increase, all these things come into play. The amount of data each year that's available for us to analyze and review is increasing. So I think we're very much in a situation where we don't know what we don't know. Obviously, there's early indications like the one you see here that seem fairly promising as it relates to public health. And the last thing I mentioned really about the employer's role as it relates to COVID-19, I think it's less about, in the world that I live in and the things that I've seen, I think there's a natural inclination to think, well, now everyone's working from home, the employer's role has diminished as it relates to being a sponsor or a actor in the healthy lifestyle of those employees. And from what we've seen, it's actually changed. If anything, I think employers are looking for ways more broadly to engage their employees, and given the current environment, engaging them in health and well-being activities seems like a natural transition, especially since the other benefits, other resources that were generally associated with the office setting is no longer available. So where we're advising employers in terms of engaging with their employees with health and well-being is one is reliable information. So there's a lot of content out there about what works and what doesn't work and what's the appropriate measures to take in terms of maintaining your health in a COVID-19 environment. And a lot of those pieces of information are conflicting. For a lot of employees, it's hard for them to decipher what makes sense and what's correct information. So I think first and foremost, it's being a good steward of what is the appropriate